I always thought I knew everything about my family, but that night, a single discovery shattered my world. There it was, my stepbrother's diary, hidden in the back of his closet, filled with secrets I wasn't meant to see. The words he wrote about me left me breathless. What I found on those pages changed everything between us, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I've always prided myself on having a close-knit family, or at least, that's what I believed. My name is Olivia, and I'm 23 years old. My life has always been predictable, comfortable even. But looking back, I realized that comfort had blinded me to the storm quietly brewing right under my nose. When my mom married Andrew 7 years ago, it felt like the missing piece of our family had finally clicked into place. Andrew was charming and steady, a comforting presence after years of just me and my mom navigating life together. But with him came someone I wasn't prepared for, his son Caleb. My new stepbrother. At first, Caleb was just there. We didn't talk much, our lives running parallel but rarely intersecting. I was 16, consumed with high school drama and college dreams, while Caleb, at 19, was focused on his part-time job and figuring out adulthood. He was polite, always kind, but distant. And I didn't mind. To me, he was just another face in the house, until everything changed. Over the years, our relationship evolved in small, subtle ways. He became more than just my stepbrother. He was a friend, someone I could rely on. Caleb had this quiet strength about him, the kind of presence that made you feel safe even in the middle of chaos. I'd never admit it out loud, but there were moments I found myself watching him a little too long, noticing things I shouldn't have. His easy laugh, the way his dark eyes seemed to read every thought in my head, the comforting warmth of his voice. It was harmless, I told myself. Just admiration for the kind of person he was. But then there were the little things, moments I couldn't explain. Like the way he'd look at me sometimes, his gaze lingering just a second too long. Or the way my heart would race when we were alone in a room. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was all in my head. After all, Caleb was family. But families are supposed to be simple, black and white. And what I was beginning to feel for Caleb, it wasn't simple at all. It was a tangle of confusion, guilt, and a terrifying spark I wasn't ready to acknowledge. It started with small, fleeting moments, things I tried to brush off as coincidences. Caleb would glance at me across the room, his dark eyes lingering a little too long before quickly looking away. I'd catch him standing just a little closer than necessary, or his hand would graze mine in a way that sent electricity coursing through me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. The first time I really started to question things was last spring, during a family movie night. Caleb and I were seated on the couch, and when the lights dimmed, I felt his knee brush against mine. It could have been an accident, but he didn't move. Neither did I. For the rest of the movie, I sat there, heart pounding, unable to focus on the screen. The tension was so thick it was suffocating, and yet I couldn't bring myself to shift away. Then came the late-night encounters. Caleb had always been a night owl, and it wasn't uncommon for him to be up wandering the house long after everyone else had gone to bed. One night, I went to grab a glass of water, and there he was, standing by the open fridge. He turned when he heard me, and our eyes locked in the dim light of the kitchen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt heavy, charged, like the whole room was holding its breath. "You couldn't sleep either?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, closing the fridge. "Yeah, too much on my mind, I guess." I should have walked away then. Instead, I stayed, leaning against the counter as we talked about everything and nothing. It was innocent on the surface. But there was an undercurrent to the conversation, something unspoken that neither of us dared to acknowledge. When Caleb finally said goodnight, his fingers brushed mine, just for a second. It was barely a touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine that kept me awake for hours. As the weeks went on, I began noticing other things too. Caleb would get quiet whenever someone else mentioned me, whether it was a casual comment about my job or a story about my childhood. He started looking at me in ways that made my stomach flip, his gaze full of something I couldn't quite place. And then there was the diary. I'd always kept a journal, a place to spill my thoughts and feelings when they became too overwhelming. One afternoon, I accidentally left it out on the coffee table, not realizing Caleb was home. When I walked into the living room and saw him holding it, my heart stopped. "You write a lot," he said, flipping through the pages. His tone was casual, but his eyes, they told a different story. I snatched the diary from his hands, heat flooding my cheeks. "That's private." "I didn't read much," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. But there was a glint in his eye, a subtle smirk on his lips that made my pulse race. Had he seen the parts about him? The moments I'd poured onto those pages late at night, admitting things I couldn't even admit to myself? That was the moment I realized Caleb knew. He could see through the facade I'd worked so hard to maintain. And worse, I couldn't tell if he was amused by it, or if he felt the same way. The more I tried to suppress my feelings, the more they seemed to rise to the surface, threatening to spill over. Every glance, every accidental touch, every stolen moment with Caleb felt like a tiny thread unraveling the fabric of my life. I didn't know how much longer I could hold it all together. The boundaries between Caleb and me began to blur in ways that were impossible to ignore. What once felt like fleeting moments of tension became undeniable. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, the connection between us was growing stronger, dangerously so. One evening, we were alone in the house. Our parents had gone out for dinner, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when Caleb walked in, barefoot and relaxed in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. He sat on the couch across from me, his eyes lingering for a moment before he spoke. "Long day?" he asked, his voice low and warm. I nodded, trying to keep my focus on my phone. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." "You've been working too hard," he said, leaning back and stretching his arms along the back of the couch. His gaze settled on me, and I could feel it like a physical weight. "You should take a break." I glanced up, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something in his expression, something intense and unspoken, that made my breath catch. I quickly looked away, but the moment hung in the air, thick and charged. As the evening went on, the tension between us only grew. I tried to keep my distance, busying myself in the kitchen, but Caleb followed, leaning against the counter as I poured a glass of water. "You're avoiding me," he said softly, his voice tinged with amusement. "I'm not," I replied too quickly, my pulse racing. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You are." I turned to face him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "What do you want me to say, Caleb?" "Nothing," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just want to know, are you feeling this too?" My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The air between us crackled, the unspoken finally teetering on the edge of being said. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my body betraying every ounce of restraint I had left. His hand brushed against mine, sending a shiver down my spine. It was such a small, simple touch, but it felt like a spark igniting something deep within me. "I don't know what you mean," I whispered, my voice trembling. Caleb stepped even closer, his gaze locking onto mine. "You do." Before I could respond, he reached up, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was soft, almost hesitant, but it set my skin ablaze. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, to stop this from going further. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen and breathless, as Caleb's hand lingered on my cheek. His thumb traced a slow, deliberate path along my jaw, and I felt my knees weaken under the weight of his touch. "This is wrong," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it doesn't feel wrong." I looked up at him, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The house, the rules, the consequences. All I could see was Caleb, standing so close, his dark eyes filled with something that mirrored the storm raging inside me. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first. But the moment his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, the floodgates broke. The kiss deepened, turning desperate and hungry, years of suppressed feelings spilling out in a tidal wave of emotion. It was everything I'd tried to deny, passion, longing, connection, all tangled together in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. His hands roamed my back, his touch setting fire to every inch of my skin. I clung to him, my mind screaming that this was a mistake even as my body begged for more. "Olivia," he murmured against my lips, his voice raw with need. "Tell me to stop, and I will. But if you don't..." I pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I knew this was a line we couldn't uncross, a decision that would change everything. But in that moment, with Caleb's arms around me and his lips inches from mine, I didn't care. "I can't," I whispered. "I don't want you to stop." That was all he needed. Caleb kissed me again, his hands tangling in my hair as he pressed me against the counter. The world outside ceased to exist. The only thing that mattered was the two of us, caught in a moment that felt as inevitable as it was forbidden. For days after that kiss, I lived in a haze of confusion and longing. Every moment with Caleb was laced with an unbearable tension, the unspoken weight of what we'd done pressing down on us. We didn't talk about it, but it was there, lingering in every glance, every accidental brush of fingers. I told myself it couldn't happen again, that we had to stop. But deep down, I knew the truth. We'd already crossed a line and there was no going back. Then came the night everything unraveled. It started innocently enough. Our parents had gone out for the evening, leaving Caleb and me alone in the house. I had planned to stay in my room, avoiding him as much as possible, but when I heard the soft knock on my door, my resolve wavered. "Olivia," Caleb called softly. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my heart racing. I knew I should tell him to leave, but instead, I found myself opening the door. He stood there, his expression torn between guilt and longing, and the sight of him sent a familiar ache through my chest. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not right." "I know," he said, stepping into the room. "But I can't stop thinking about you." "About us?" "Caleb," I started, but my words trailed off as he moved closer, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt my resolve slipping away once again. "We can figure this out," he said, his voice earnest. "I don't care what anyone thinks. I can't pretend I don't feel this anymore." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and before I knew it, I was in his arms again, our lips colliding in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. The room seemed to spin around us as we tumbled onto the bed, our bodies moving together in a way that felt both inevitable and terrifying. For a moment, it was as though nothing else existed, just Caleb and me, lost in the heat of the moment. But then, the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the illusion. We froze, our breaths mingling as the realization hit us. Our parents were home. "Shit," Caleb muttered, pulling away and running a hand through his hair. "They can't find us like this." Panic surged through me as I scrambled to fix my clothes, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps approaching the house only heightened my anxiety, and I felt like I was about to break. "Go," I whispered urgently, pushing Caleb toward the door. "We can't let them see you in here." He nodded, his expression conflicted, and slipped out of the room just as the front door opened. I sat there, trembling, as my mom's voice echoed through the house. "Olivia? Caleb? Are you two home?" I forced myself to take a deep breath and stood, smoothing my hair as I walked out to greet them. "Yeah, we're here," I said, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. My mom smiled, setting her purse on the counter. "How was your evening?" "Fine," I replied, glancing toward Caleb as he walked into the room. His expression was calm, composed, as though nothing had happened. I envied his ability to hide his emotions so effortlessly. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and small talk. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, every word and gesture calculated to avoid raising suspicion. But beneath the surface, the tension between Caleb and me simmered, threatening to boil over at any moment. The breaking point came later that week. I had been doing my best to avoid Caleb, throwing myself into work and spending as little time at home as possible. But one afternoon, I came home to find the house empty, except for him. He was in the living room, leaning against the back of the couch, and the moment he saw me, I knew something was wrong. His expression was serious, his jaw tight, and I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. "What's going on?" I asked cautiously. He held up a small, familiar notebook, my diary. My blood ran cold. "Why was this under the couch?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged with something I couldn't place. "I don't know," I said quickly, reaching for it, but he held it out of my reach. "Olivia," he said, his tone softening. I read it. My heart stopped. "You what?" "I didn't mean to," he said, running a hand through his hair. It fell open and I saw my name. I couldn't stop myself. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. All the secrets I had poured into that diary, the confessions I had been too afraid to say out loud, they were all laid bare now. "Caleb, I started, but he cut me off." "Is it true?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Everything you wrote, is it true?" I looked away, shame and fear twisting in my chest. "Yes," I whispered. "It's true." For a moment, there was only silence. Then Caleb stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's wrong," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "Because I was afraid of what it would do to us. To our family." "Olivia," his voice was gentle, but I could hear the anguish in it. "You don't have to carry this alone." I shook my head, the tears spilling over. "It doesn't matter now. They'll never understand." We'll destroy everything. But Caleb didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. Maybe it's worth the risk. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening interrupted us. We both froze, the reality of the situation crashing down around us. Our parents were home again, and we were out of time. This time, there was no escaping the truth. The diary lay open on the table, my confessions staring back at me like a ticking time bomb. And as I heard my mom's voice call out from the hallway, I knew that everything was about to change. The moment my mom walked into the living room, her cheerful expression froze. Her eyes darted between Caleb and me, then landed on the open diary sitting on the coffee table. I could feel the blood drain from my face as panic clawed at my chest. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp with confusion. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Caleb stepped forward, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. "It's not what it looks like," he said quickly, but the words sounded hollow even to me. My mom's eyes narrowed as she picked up the diary, flipping through the pages. I wanted to snatch it away, to scream and run, but I was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my ears. When she reached one of the incriminating entries, her face paled. Her hands trembled as she looked up at me, her voice breaking. "Olivia, what is this?" I couldn't meet her gaze. Shame burned hot in my chest, and tears blurred my vision. "Mom, I can explain," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't want to hear it. She turned to Caleb, her expression a mix of hurt and betrayal. "And you? Did you know about this?" Caleb hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I found out recently," he admitted. "But it's not what you think. We haven't, nothing's happened." His words felt like a slap. While technically true, they didn't erase the charged moments we'd shared, the kisses, the unspoken promises. My mom's face crumpled, and she sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. "I trusted you too. I thought we were a family." Her words cut deeper than I expected, and the weight of what we'd done, what we'd risked, finally hit me. I sank to my knees in front of her, my hands clutching hers. "I'm sorry," I choked out, the tears spilling freely now. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." But my apologies felt hollow. The damage was already done. My mom pulled away, standing abruptly. "I can't deal with this right now," she said, her voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. "I need some time to think." She stormed out of the room, leaving Caleb and me standing there in a deafening silence. I looked over at him, my vision blurred with tears. "What do we do now?" I whispered. He shook his head, his expression as broken as I felt. "I don't know." The fallout was swift and brutal. My mom barely spoke to me for days, her disappointment hanging heavy in the air. My stepdad, Andrew, was quieter than usual, his presence more a shadow than a comfort. And Caleb stayed away. I wanted to talk to him, to make sense of everything, but he avoided me like the plague. Every time I saw him, he seemed to shrink further into himself, the light in his eyes dimming. It was like we were both drowning, pulled under by the weight of what we'd done. The hardest part was the silence. The unspoken tension in the house was suffocating, every glance and pause loaded with meaning. My mom avoided being alone with me, and when she did speak, her words were clipped and cold. It was like I'd become a stranger in my own home. One evening, Caleb and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. I was making tea, my hands shaking as I poured the water, when he walked in. For a moment, we just stood there, the tension between us almost unbearable. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "For all of this." I turned to him, my throat tightening. "It's not just your fault," I said softly. "We both let it happen." He nodded, his jaw clenched. I think I should leave. For real this time." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Leave?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "You can't just leave." "I have to," he said, his eyes filled with regret. "Staying here will only make things worse. For everyone." Tears welled in my eyes, but I knew he was right. As much as I hated the thought of him leaving, I couldn't deny that his presence only added fuel to the fire. If we were ever going to repair the damage we'd caused, we needed distance. Caleb moved out the following week. Watching him pack his things was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Every box he carried out of the house felt like another piece of my heart being ripped away. I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him we could figure it out together, but I knew it was pointless. Our parents tried to move on, but the cracks in our family were obvious. My mom's trust in me was shattered, and no matter how much I apologized, I couldn't undo what had happened. I spent my days walking on eggshells trying to make amends, but it was clear that things would never be the same. As for Caleb, he kept his distance. We exchanged a few texts at first, short, polite messages that felt more like strangers than the people we used to be. But eventually, even that faded, and he became nothing more than a ghost of the life we'd once shared. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, the tension in the house began to ease. My mom started talking to me again, though her words were careful and guarded. Andrew tried to keep the peace, but his strained smiles betrayed the hurt he was still carrying. We were piecing ourselves back together, but the scars would always remain. The weeks after Caleb left felt like walking through a storm that had already passed, the damage visible everywhere, but the winds and chaos gone. The silence in the house was heavy, and though life moved on, the weight of what had happened lingered in every corner. I threw myself into my work, trying to forget, trying to rebuild the fractured pieces of my life. My mom eventually softened, but things between us were never the same. She tried to be supportive in her way, but there was a guardedness in her that hadn't been there before. It was like she no longer knew how to see me as her daughter, as though I had become someone else entirely. I understood. I couldn't blame her. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, she finally broke the silence that had hung between us for months. "Olivia," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "I know you didn't mean for things to get so complicated. But you have to understand, what happened hurt more than just you and Caleb. It hurt this family." "I know," I said softly, tears stinging my eyes. "I regret it every day." She sighed, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. "I hope you've learned something from all this. Sometimes love isn't enough to make something right. Sometimes the best thing we can do is let go." Her words stayed with me long after that conversation. Letting go of Caleb, of the guilt, of the life I thought I wanted, became the hardest lesson I've ever had to learn. Months later, I found myself standing outside Caleb's new apartment. I hadn't planned to visit him, but something inside me needed closure. I knocked, my heart pounding, and when he opened the door, the sight of him took my breath away. He looked the same, yet different, calmer, more distant, like time and space had helped him rebuild himself. "Olivia," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling suddenly foolish. "I guess I needed to see you." He stepped aside, letting me in, and we sat together in his small living room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't tense, but it wasn't easy either. "I'm sorry," I said finally, the words spilling out in a rush. "For everything. For what I put you through, for what we did to our family." Caleb nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm sorry too. I shouldn't have let things get as far as they did." We talked for hours that night, laying everything bare, the confusion, the guilt, the love that had burned so brightly but couldn't survive in the light of day. By the time I left, I felt lighter, as though a weight I'd been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. "I'll always care about you, Olivia," Caleb said as I stood in the doorway. "But we have to let this go. For good." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, and hugged him one last time. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a release. In the years that followed, I worked hard to rebuild my relationship with my mom and Andrew. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wondered if things would ever feel normal again. But slowly, with time and effort, the wounds began to heal. As for Caleb, I didn't see him much after that night. We drifted into separate lives, the memories of what we'd shared fading into the background. I missed him sometimes in quiet moments when the world felt too big and too empty. But I knew it was for the best. Some loves aren't meant to be, no matter how powerful they feel. Looking back, I've come to understand the lessons buried in the pain. Love can be messy, complicated, and destructive when it crosses boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. It taught me the value of self-control, of putting the well-being of others above my own desires. Most of all, it taught me that sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. I don't know if Caleb feels the same, but I hope he's found peace. I hope he's found a way to move forward, just as I have. Because in the end, love isn't about possession or obsession. It's about knowing when to let go. What would you have done in Olivia's position? Could you have let go, or would you have risked it all for love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And if this story left you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. More shocking stories are just around the corner, and you won't want to miss them.